parking variance to confirm that that level of parking, 1,168 spaces, is adequate for the site. The ordinances that the township has adopted reflect the fact that the ORD zone was to be enhanced by the RC development, and that's in the ORD zone, it's in the master plan. So these two properties was always intended by the ordinances that they would work together, and this is part of working together. So even after the entranceway has changed and the loop path is put through the ORD zone, there will still be 1,168 spaces. There's no other changes being made to that property, and we're requesting that the variance be granted for that part of the property. The thrust of the reason for the variance is that the 3.3 per thousand ratio of parking spaces for office research properties is not appropriate for this property, given the way it's utilized and configured. There's not going to be equipment use of this property, and that's why we're seeking the variance. Another development, and I think it's an important one, is that Advance has now acquired the entirety of the ownership interest of the condominiums in the RC development. So there was a partner from New England that was involved in the project. That interest has been changed to an ownership in Advance of those condominiums, and I think that's a very positive development for this project, because after all, this is a mixed-use project, and I think we've all seen over the years that there can be problems when you have non-unified ownership at this stage of the project development. And we certainly had that with that one day. And that's not to cast blame on anybody, but just to state a fact. So anyhow, that we have a single owner of those interests. So the interest in the property, in the overall property, 110 acres of the Santa Fe site by Thor, which owns the 47 acres, and Advance, which owns the balance of the property. A few housekeeping matters just to hit on. One is, I don't think it's clear in the variance report, but over the time since the last hearing, we did make sure that we were able to expand the parking spaces in front of the proposed supermarket to 9.5 by 18. So we have over 440 spaces there. That was not the case perhaps on some of the prior iterations of this plan. Secondly, the question has come up from Scarlett repeatedly about what entity is going to manage the common areas and open space. And so there's an existing entity called the Petersbrook Village Association, which is responsible for the maintenance of all common elements, lawns, the loop path, landscaping, known as House and Farms, but all of that will be managed by an existing condominium association, Petersbrook Village Association. Another housekeeping matter, we've had some requests over time to show the actual materials that will be used on the commercial part of the project, so that the board members could match them up against what we presented in our presentations to the board. So they're here, and Mr. Diamond, the architect, will be here to testify briefly about which buildings and which materials fit together. So those are the principal things to talk about in terms of housekeeping. Van Cleef Engineering did a report last week, which we received. We talked to Van Cleef, and we agreed that all of the Van Cleef report could be either a condition of the approval or dealt with through compliance with the approval. So those, I think, are resolved in that way. A couple of other things to resolve. One is that in Ms. Doyle's report and her phasing plan, she talked about having submissions of construction plans by June 30 and December 31st. Obviously, she was working with some of the older documents. And so, we have proposed that the construction plans be submitted, and Mr. Nogales wanted a direct date that he could put his finger on. So within 6 months of the date of any resolution that you should pass, we will deliver construction plans for the entire frontage of the property, including the traffic light at 4th Street. So all of that would be covered in plans delivered to DOT within 6 months. The rest of the construction plans, which involve submission of plans to the township and to the county, would be done 6 months thereafter. Those plans would be submitted to those agencies respectively within an additional 6-month period. That's a very aggressive schedule, but one that the applicant is willing to live by. One of the things in the phasing schedule is the soils stockpile, and we would like that to be to move that soil stockpile in phases 1 and 2, not just in phase 1. It can be used to surcharge as the project is developed. That's a minor point that Ms. Doyle has talked to her about. And we would like to have the right to move forward with 3 buildings in phase 2. We've always talked about having the grocer, the wellness building, and we would like to also be able to go ahead with the residential building as we install the traffic improvements. And that we would have all the traffic improvements installed before the third of those buildings. So that would be all the traffic improvements along the frontage and the light on the street. So all the major affecting the project traffic improvements. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to call 5 witnesses. Most of them have been previously sworn. You're here primarily to discuss the Thor parking variance because we essentially finished with our witnesses previously, except for Mr. Bynum. So,
Mr. Colby, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
So when you were just discussing, you said 3 buildings are going to be built in phase 2. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay, do you know which buildings?
Yes. It would be the grocer, the wellness building, and the residential building, also known as Building 11. Right now, Ms. Doyle's phasing plan calls for 2 buildings, so we'd like to be able to have the opportunity to do a 3rd building in that phase 2 while we're doing the bulk of the traffic improvements.
Madam Chairman, I'd like to make a slight clarification of what he said, Ms. Doyle's chart for phase 2. What that chart was is the chart that the applicant provided in the submission that was around end of January of this year. So I didn't create it myself.
You edited it, that's not fine. We accept your edits, except as I've noted.
Okay, thank you.
So, with that introduction, Mr. Collins, I have 2 witnesses who are not sworn of the 5 who intend.
House President.
Okay, Mr. Dan Laughlin and Craig Hearn, please step up and be sworn.
Gentlemen, come by this mic, by Mr. Coakley, or by the table, and just please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth to help you God?
I do.
And please, starting on my left, your right, please state your name and give us an address.
Craig Herman, Hermann. I work for PSS. The address is 67B Mountain Boulevard Extension, Warren, New Jersey.
Dan Laughlin, Loughlin. I work for JLL. My office is at 8 Campus Drive in Parsippany.
Thank you, gentlemen.
So I think Mr. Herman will be the first witness, and Ms. Dory will ask any questions.
One more question, Mr. Cooley. You said there were 5 witnesses tonight, correct?
Yes,
Can you just tell me the remaining 3?
yes. Mr. Gary Dean will testify regarding the parking variance. He did a report on parking last night. Mr. Phillips, Paul Phillips, is a planner, will testify about parking variance. And Mr. Diamond will testify regarding the material rules.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? We'll proceed.
Now, I just want to remind people that there's another room down here with extra seating and TVs available to see what's going on in here. So if you'd like a seat, you can go down there and get an available seat. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the board. Nicole Dory, Colin Foley. It's nice to be before you all again on this application. As Kevin mentioned, we have a few witnesses for the ORD parking variance. So there'll be 4 witnesses for that. I'll start with Craig Herman and Gary Dean. Craig is working on this. He's with PSNS, and he'll give you an overview of the existing parking and buildings in the ORD zone. And Gary will testify as to his parking study. So I'd like to present Craig Herman first. He has not been qualified yet, so I'll start with that.
Yes, that'd be fine.
Okay, Mr. Herman, you can give the board the benefit of your educational background and experience.
Yes. I am a 1996 graduate from the Rutgers University College of Engineering, BS in Civil Engineering, and I have been a New Jersey professional engineer since 2004.
Okay, and have you testified before other boards before?
Yes, I have. I testified in front of many boards throughout the state, Montville, Northville, Emerson and Bergen County, Mount Olive Township and Pine Hill Township in Morris County, and Belvedere and Hackettstown, Warren County, just to name a few. I've been accepted as an expert witness both as the engineer for the applicant and also as a board engineer.
Board will recognize and accept Craig Herman's qualifications as a professional engineer.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Herman, were you involved in preparing the engineering plans for this application?
Yes, I was.
Okay, can you please describe for the board the location of the buildings in the ORD zone and the existing parking, and how the parking will be modified as a result of the redevelopment?
Okay, so
Mr. Herman, we don't mind if you stand on this side, so that when you point to things, the public might be able to see at least some of them. And also, if you want to go back a little bit further with the drawings, I think we can see it, and maybe more people will be able to see it. Thank you.
So what we have in front of you right now is a aerial image of the existing property. This has already been provided as an exhibit in past meeting. And right now it is an existing 109.58 acre site, and we're focusing on the ORD zone of the site, which is located in the northwest corner of the site, which is located in about this area right here. Just to orientate you to the property, to the west is 287, to the east is 202, 206. There is residential properties on the opposite side, 202, 206 to the east. To the north, we have residential properties and the temple, and to the south, we have additional residential properties.
What was that exhibit number again, Mr. Herman?
I don't know what the exhibit number was.
It was previously marked, I can find out.
Might be on it somewhere, Mr. Herman. Might be on the back somewhere.
Actually, I think I reprinted this.
Okay. We'll receive it from the story.
So what I have in front of you right now is a colorized version of sheet C, that's 03.01 of the PSM's plan set. And it's entitled the ORD Zone Analysis Plan. The ORD portion of the site is what's colored here. is a R&D facility, and it includes approximately 10 buildings labeled JD, JR2, JR1, Building N, Building M, Building K, L, G, and HY, and there's also Building F, which is essentially utility plant. Mr. Coakley had referenced the condominium units owned by 4, and those are condominium units 2 and 3, which condominium unit 2 is located to the east of the existing 13th Avenue, which will remain, and to the west is condominium 3, which is basically the northwesterly corner of the property. The plan is to maintain this as it is now, and as we reviewed the application since we were last here, we identified the parking variance requirement. Based on the 654,753 square feet of combination office and laboratory use, at a rate of 1 parking stall for every 300 square feet, which is the ordinance requirement. 2,183 parking spaces are required for this use, to support this use based on the ordinance requirements. At the existing time, there is a total of 1,190 stalls, and they're spread out pretty reasonably with the site. There's a few larger parking areas to the north of the buildings, and there's a parking garage to the southwest of the buildings. Now, as over the past few months, few years, that we've been developing this plan and with the help of the planning board, we have realigned the entranceway to the R&D facility for a few reasons. Number one, what is now existing as 4th Street will become Discovery Drive, and Discovery Drive has been extended to connect into the R&D facility. That and wanting to provide a connection to the proposed redevelopment, we needed to realign this entranceway into the R&D facility or the ORD zone. With that, there was a parking area in front of the cooling towers that we needed to reconstruct, and we lost 22 parking spaces when we did that. We were able to gain some back in this area, so we didn't lose the whole parking lot, but at the end, we weren't able to provide 22 parking spaces. So with that being said, we need 2,183 parking spaces based on the ordinance requirements. We're providing a total of 1,168 parking spaces, which includes 500 parking spaces in the major parking lots, which includes parking lot 8A, 8, 9, K, 13, and there's a few other small parking areas within the buildings itself. And then a 668 parking stall parking garage located to the southwest of the buildings. 668 in the parking garage and the 500 surface parking stalls provides us with the 1168 that we're proposing.
I have no further questions for Mr. Herman. Are there any questions from the board?
I have a question, and you may have said this, so I apologize. So you're going to provide 1168, correct?
Yes.
Right now, there's 1190,
Yes.
and why is it decreasing?
There is a parking stall in the parking lot in front of the cooling towers, right where I'm pointing right here. And because we needed to realign the driveway and put in the stormwater detention system, we weren't able to provide the total number in there. We have a few additional parking areas that we're able to provide between these buildings, but at the end of the day, the result is 22 less parking stalls.
And do you know on average how many of those spaces are occupied a day now?
That will be provided through testimony from one or the other.
Okay. And are you, is there, if the opportunity, if you need to in the future, is there an area where you can provide additional parking?
There are some areas that we can provide additional parking, say, with some open areas over here, around parking lot 9. There is also ability somewhere in the area just to the back of the garage.
And I just wanted to clarify that the variance is based upon the 1168 spaces.
That's considered a secure area, right? The floor R&D, fenced in, security.
Yes.
So the requirement is that all the people who work in that area have to be able to park in that area, right?
Yes.
Now, the overflow you're seeking is outside the protected, that you identify as potential is outside the protected area, is that true?
No, it's located inside the protected area.
Okay, so the commitment then is everybody who works there can park there or something like that?
Yes.
And you'll hear additional testimony that the existing parking is more than sufficient for the use of the property.
Is there any other member of the board with a question to this witness? Seeing none, I'm going to open it up to the public. If any member of the public has a question for this witness regarding his testimony, please come forward, state your name and address for the record. Thank you.
Good evening, Matthew Mensch, 1303 Ryder Avenue. Sir, could you explain to the public what the scope of your job with regard to testimony, did these plans work? I mean, you provided a testimony regarding the number of parking spaces, but did you provide any analysis with regard to the number of spaces, where the spaces should go, help design where they should go? I'm not sure what your role as part of this team dealing with traffic and parking is.
As far as the OR&D zone, my role was to look at the existing parking stalls that are available, and compare that to the required parking calculation based on the ordinance requirements for the zone.
Did you do any independent analysis as to whether or not the number of stalls available is sufficient?
That will be reviewed by the person that will come up with me.
Did you do any analysis about where, if the planning board came back and said they weren't going to give you a waiver, where from an engineering standpoint would you put the required parking? Or what impact would it have on the application if you had to put in the additional parking stalls?
We took a look at that. We have some available areas, as I indicated before. There's some open areas around this parking area and then behind the parking garage that we could possibly put some additional parking stalls. There is a number of things we would need to deal with, layout to see how many we could get. There's also some permitting that will be involved because there are environmental constraints in these areas. So there's a lot that we would need to do, but those are some open areas that could possibly be used for future parking.
Have you done any analysis as to how many spots you could get if you were to utilize some of those open areas?
Not at this point, no.
Do you have any analysis as to what kind of permits would be needed specifically in order to accommodate those extra spots?
Like I said, we would need to look at a few things. There are some environmental constraints that would involve DEP and town courts with their permitting, so we could take a look at that.
If I don't have the exact numbers, but it's about 1,000 units that you're short, sir?
About that, yes.
And is it your testimony before the board and the public today that, given the fact that you're 1,000 units short, that you have not done any analysis as to how you can come closer to that number, or how you would even meet that number if you're denied the waiver?
That will be addressed by the person that did that study.
Well, I'm asking about from an engineering standpoint. You just testified regarding where you would put spaces. I assume a planner will come up and testify about how often spaces will be used and traffic flow and those matters. But from an engineering standpoint, if you were required to put in 2,000 units, is it your testimony that you don't have a plan to do that?
Well, we have if I just might interrupt, we have a traffic engineer that's going to be testifying next.
I understand, but I'm asking about an engineering question, which is from a planning engineering standpoint. Where would you put the units? Or what changes would you have to make to the plan to accommodate the waiver? Because the waiver is not automatic. This board could decide that it wants to uphold the ordinance that the township has in place and require you to put in 2,000, change units. So my question is, does the applicant have a plan to meet that 2,000 units if the waiver is denied?
We would need to look at exactly how we will lay out and how many parking stalls we can get in those possible areas that I just mentioned.
With the testimony that you gave, you talked about the existing number of parking spaces and noted that we lost a couple with regards to the water tower. done any engineering work to come even close to or improve the number of parking spaces from what's already there? Or are you simply saying, we're gonna rest on what's there, we have no plan to add additional parking spaces at all?
If I just might interject here, I did clarify earlier that this variance request is based on the existing parking of 1,168 spaces. We have generally identified other areas that could accommodate stalls if needed, but this variance request is based on 1,168 spaces being more than adequate for the existing use. And we will have the traffic engineer to provide that testimony. Mr. Herman has identified the existing parking and the ordinance requirements.
Ma'am, there's comments that I heard that they can't hear you. Perhaps either you get closer to the mic or we have another, maybe we should give her the second mic so that I'm sure that the.
Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to clarify that the parking variance request of the ORD zone times the charm. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that the parking variance request for the ORD zone is based upon 1,168 spaces being more than adequate for the existing use. The purpose of Mr. Herman's testimony was to identify the existing parking in the ORD zone and the parking areas and possible locations if parking was ever required in the future, but the present application for a variance is based upon existing conditions and existing parking. There's no contemplated future addition of parking at this time.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I didn't actually get an answer to the last question, which was, have you done, you have not looked at any alternatives specifically that would provide additional parking such that it would get you closer to the number required by the ordinance? Am I correct?
I apologize, I thought I answered that question before. We identified, as we talked about, certain areas, but no, we have not done a layout to see how many parking stalls that could get in those areas.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Please step forward with questions for this witness regarding his testimony.
Andy Fresco, 15 Glen Eagles Drive, Bridgewater. Just a quick question. Would curtailing or reducing any of the buildings help you meet the requirement without getting the variance?
From a calculation standpoint, if the square foot area goes down, the parking requirement based on, I apologize. It's not working out? Is it better? Okay. Sorry. Can you ask that question again? I'm sorry.
Sure. So we're short parking spaces. If these folks don't grant you the variance, you'll need to figure out another way around it. To Matt's point, I'm asking if you reduce the scope of this entire project, would you then be able to work with the parking spaces that meet the town's rules?
I can't talk to any plan of any reduction in building, but from a mathematical standpoint, if you reduce the square foot, the parking requirement would go down.
Great, okay, great, thank you.
Please step forward with questions for this witness regarding his testimony. Thanks.
My name is Mary Gallagher, from Island Avenue, Bridgewater, and I just, regarding all the parking, I'm wondering about truck delivery. You've got a grocery store, boutiques, and everything. We're talking about parking, but what about delivery or offsetting of that? I just don't know if there's room.
Just wanted to clarify that question, that this parking variance is only for the ORD zone, which is currently a research and development campus.
Good evening.
Diane Mine, M-I-N-E, 743 Cedar Brook Road. My question is, if you are not given approval and you need to go to those areas that you designated as environmentally challenging, what are the environmental issues that you're think you know are of concern?
There are some environmental constraints. The Flint Hazard area does extend into that area. And there are some wetlands. You need to hold it closer. There are some wetlands, there are some wetlands located along the Peters Brook. So we would need to address all the requirements of the DEP for any construction that we do within those constrained areas.
I live right across diagonally behind it, and I'm very familiar with the wetland problem and the environmental concerns that we don't have the turtles that we used to have. So are you claiming that you would disrupt an area that is already environmentally challenged and put cars parked on that area? That would be your plan?
If I might just interject, the plan right now is not to add any additional parking. We're asking for an approval that the 1,168 spaces that exist are more than adequate. So if we have testimony that will demonstrate that, and at this time we're not proposing any additional parking.
Okay, I'm just concerned that the additional parking you're requesting doesn't seem feasible, and then from that step, your next step would be more of a problem. But as a relative step, it's not a big issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councilman.
I thought the issue was not that the 1,100 was sufficient, but if the 1,100 is not sufficient, you have property available that will add the necessary parking spots.
Yes, that's correct.
And I think the lady's question was, is there an environmentally sensitive area that you're going to encroach upon if you attempt to get beyond the 1,100? And it sounded like, we know there's 1,100, but you're not just asking for approval for 1,100, you're asking for approval for the 1,100, and whatever else number you need up to 1,900, and then you'll find the space for it somehow.
No, I'm sorry if it was confusing, but we're just asking for approval for the 1,168 spaces, and we will have witnesses to testify that that's more than adequate, and we're not planning on any existing impervious coverage to provide additional parking.
And sorry, I guess I don't understand. I thought my original thing was, you have 1,100, you know they're there, but if you needed more, you could expand beyond the 1,100. But I think you're saying you never expect to expand beyond the 1,100.
That's correct.
So what you're really saying is you want an exception to the ordinance since it's 1,100 is okay.
Well, the applicant understands if there was any change in the use of the ORD zone portion of the property, they would have to return to the board, but at this time, they're asking for a variance based on 1,168 spaces.
Good evening, how are you?
Kulag, 13 Ramsey Street in Bridgewater. Just a quick question. 1,168 spaces is what you're asking for to be improved. What did the ordinance call for? What's the gross number that the ordinance calls for?
2,183.
We're approximately 1,000 short?
1,015.
1,015. And your analysis is that the existing use for the property will be more than adequately served. So are you suggesting that the ordinance is off by 50%?
We will have an additional witness to testify to the particular use here, but what we're testifying, or will testify to, is that the ordinance requirement for general office use didn't contemplate this type of use that's existing on the property, and so the parking is more than adequate.
So the use that will be, that is, right now is being projected based on future use and current use will not change, is what you suggest.
No, the existing parking that's there is based upon the existing use of the property.
So if employers change, if usage slightly, we don't know what technology is going to bring. So if there are more people coming into the same existing facility requiring more parking, there's no adequate plan for it. It's just the future, we'll come back to you and ask.
The applicant understands that if there's a substantial change that affects parking, they will have to return to the board.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public with questions questions for this witness regarding his testimony? Good evening.
Hi, I'm Laura Whalen, 1238 Mount Vernon Road. I have a question. Bridgewater is number 8 in the state in terms of redevelopment deals. Why should we give you a variance at all? People want to develop here. People want to own here. We're number 8 in the state out of 535 municipalities. What's for us?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure if the question relates to Mr. Herman's expertise or testimony.
You have to ask questions that related to what he talked about, so.
So maybe it's a question for the planning board?
You have to ask questions of this witness.
Yeah, right now, we're just asking questions of the witness regarding his testimony. There's going to be an opportunity later for additional comments.
Okay, great. So what is the projected employment numbers? How many people will be employed in that zone?
You will have another witness that will testify as to the use of the property and those types of questions.
Could you tell me the number that was used in the calculations in order to calculate the parking spots?
The number that was used to calculate, the required parking is based on the ordinance requirement of 1 stall for every 300 square feet for office and laboratory use. For 654,738 square feet, that's equal to 2,183 parking stalls required for those 2 uses within the RD facility.
So it's simply based on space and not the number of employees?
Correct.
Correct. So if there's 3,000 to 4,000 people expected to be employed in the entire complex, is there a portion, what portion of that is covered by this zone and what portion is the other zones? And do those other zones have a similar witness or expert testimony?
Well, just to take the first part of your question, the ordinance requirement is based upon square footage and not the number of employees. And we previously testified as to parking requirements for the RD, which is the redevelopment portion.
Is this no more question on that?
There's no more testimony presented for that today. This testimony is only for the parking variance for the ORD zone.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Please come forward, state your name and address for the record.
Hi, Sarah Fox, 16 Gibson, Paris, New Jersey. So my question I have, so you are pointing out that you have designated areas that you would put the additional, parking if you don't get the variance. What would you, let's say you can't touch the wetlands, let's say DEP says, left, no. What would you, to help, I guess, to alleviate that, or at least get to your numbers that you want, would you put a structure there? Like, would it be another parking garage so that you could, or is that completely out of your realm to accommodate those extra parking spaces?
If we needed to provide additional spaces, we would return to the board. At this time, the parking variance is only for the existing stalls.
So you guys haven't thought about like whether or not it would be a parking garage that you need to put in there, in those extra spaces that you're talking about?
We would do that in the future if we had to return to the board.
And have you considered the growth that this particular site might have over the next 10, 15 years?
There'll be an additional witness that'll testify as to the current use of the property and that it's likely to remain as it currently exists because it would be economically unfeasible to change it. So the current parking variance request is for the existing use, which is contemplated to remain.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
Bill Hobbs, 770 Mountain View Avenue, Bridgewater. I'm just kind of getting hung up on the current usage. I keep on hearing you say that based on the current usage, which to me sounds like number of employees. I heard you say that the 301 square foot each spot in the current ordinance doesn't necessarily apply to the way the space is currently being used. Given that, could the current employers just put in more of the same type of employees using the space the same way they're using now? And if so, how many more could they put in there without going to the board for any sort of changes in approval or I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm using the right words, variances or zoning. I'm just trying to figure out whether or not you've taken into account any sort of increase in employees' current usage versus the 1,168 spots.
Madam Chair, if I may, we will have another witness that will be able to address these sorts of questions. This is not within Mr. Herman's expertise or scope of his testimony.
Who's going to be able to answer those questions, Mr. Dean?
Mr. Dean will provide some testimony as to that, and also there will be a real estate broker, Mr. Laughlin.
Okay. Thank you.
Paweł Placek, Karting Telegraph. Paweł Placek. So my question is following. You're talking about current use, right? And it's a little bit built up on the previous question. As you know, the companies are using a lot of open space models right now, where they can fit 3-4 times many people as they can in the fixed office model. What's the current use? Is it based on cubicles and offices? It's an open space. Can it skyrocket in the air like 3-4 times or maybe 5 times?
Again, Madam Chair, I think this question is more appropriate for the other two witnesses.
Okay. But we're sitting in the room, usually we're not getting the questions being answered, so we wait for the witness.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public with questions for this witness regarding his testimony? Seeing none? Oh, hang on. Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Patrick Olenek, 458 Foothill Road, Bridgewater. My question to you, sir, is with work from home detail, do we have any assurances from the businesses that are currently there that, you know, people are actually going to come to work and destroy this property? Is there any studies been done on, you know, a lot of employers are cutting back in many ways. There's no need to really, you know, be excessive with parking spaces. Is that a consideration?
I'm sorry, sir, but the ordinance requirement for parking is based upon square footage, and at this time, we don't have any information about the future, employees, or whether the employees are actually using the space. Is that your question?
That is my question. I think it's important to decide who's actually employed in the future.
Madam Chair, I don't believe this question is within the scope of Mr. Herman's testimony.
Mr. You have to focus questions about the testimony that Mr. Herman gave, and he didn't talk about that, so.
Okay, that's okay.
Thank you. Any other member of the public with a question for this witness regarding his testimony, please come forward. Anyone? Okay. Thank you.
So if I may, if we could move on to Mr. Dean.
Yes, please.
Mr. Dean's qualifications as a professional engineer and a traffic engineer and expert have previously been accepted and are still accepted. And Mr. Dean, you understand that you are still under oath?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
And Mr. Dean submitted a parking variance report dated August 29th. It included a series of parking surveys that his firm completed, as well as the report that demonstrates the existing parking is more than adequate for this area of the property. So, Mr. Dean, could you please give the board an overview of your parking variance study that you already done?
Good evening, and I do understand I'm still under oath. I'm going to refer to an aerial exhibit. It's an image from Mr. Herman's firm, PS&S, that depicts the property in question. North is to the right-hand side of the exhibit. I'll make it easier. North is not to the top, 287 is to the left, and Route 202, 206 is to the right. You've heard a description as to the number of parking spaces that are presently on the campus. When I say the campus, I am referring to that section of the overall tract that essentially is the western side of the overall property. That is a secured area that is gate and guard controlled, that is a research and development campus. That particular portion of the site, lying in a different zone, as you've heard, requires roughly 2,200 parking spaces. The site doesn't have that today. The site is fully developed today, and the site, by and large, is fully occupied today. Board is aware, the public perhaps doesn't realize that an ordinance is a guiding, planning tool where we don't have specific information, where it's a guess, it's an estimate as to certain requirements. As the site is developed and we see tenancy, we have the opportunity to go out and study and see whether the ordinance in fact makes sense or not, given the particular land use. My firm was retained about a year and a half ago to conduct that very study. And what we did was early to mid-June of 2018, we actually surveyed, using a drone, the occupancy of every single parking space that's a surface space. And I also had personnel go within, I'm pointing to the multi-story parking garage. And we looked at the parking demands of this campus during peak periods. And those periods are generally concentrated at 10 in the morning and around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we studied exactly the parking demands and patterns for this site. And we started on June 5th. We went to June 6th, 7th, 8th in the morning, Tuesday the 12th, and Wednesday, June 13th. We've compiled all of that data, and it's summarized in our report addressed to the board dated August 29th, 2019. Given that a certain amount of time had elapsed since this presentation, we also did a test this summer to identify whether we were reasonably close. And the findings were virtually identical. The single peak day of use was on June 12th, and we identified to be the applicant.
Do you know for whom he's testifying today?
Yes, Mr. Dean is here on behalf of both Floor and Advance.
One question about what you had said earlier. You said there was a security fence that's going to segregate this portion from the other portion of the proposed development?
That's correct.
Could you outline where that will be? Because none of us can see it. Or
I cannot. Candidly, I don't know where it is.
Does it exist today?
It exists around the perimeter of the entire campus. And essentially, should the front portion receive the approvals, the fence around, I'll call it the easterly perimeter, will then be moved and essentially bisect the site, separating the ORD westerly portion of the site with the RC redevelopment portion on the easterly side of the site.
And the purpose of that fence is to have no interaction between the two parcels? Is that fair to say?
It's a security protocol. The interaction, as far as it does segregate parking and circulation, but it's principally to keep the R&D campus secure.
Because there may be questions, and certainly I will have them, about the interaction between the two parcels now that you've bifurcated the site with the new owner, as it pertains to overflow parking from the proposed development of the other part of the site. So if there's no fence currently, and we don't know where it's going to be, I don't see how the planning board can make a decision to grant a variance based on this testimony when there are other mitigating factors or other dependencies which haven't been testified to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Timothy Ring, 17 Lawton Road. Sir, you just testified that there was going to be a security fence that would bifurcate the two parcels. Is that correct?
Correct.
Can you tell me a little bit more how the security fence will accomplish that?
I cannot answer that.
But yet you're able to testify that it will do that.
Well, there's a security fence today
Okay.
that restricts access to the site, but for a few, I'll call them publicly accessible areas. As part of the zone boundary that was created for the RC district to the east and the ORD zone to the west, that fence, by and large, and I'm not testifying as to its precise location, will by and large stick to that zone line. So it will have, whatever its materials are, it will have a guard, it will have employee key cards as part of the redevelopment.
Now, I'm not so much interested in where it's going to be located. I'm more interested, I think, as you're doing a parking study, you would want to know, while I understand this is now separated basically into two different projects, there is obviously still connections, and parking in one area can impact the other. So for example, if we're bifurcating this, if I understand what you're trying to suggest, the people that work in the ORD zone would be able to park behind that bifurcated area, behind that fence, but the folks that utilize the rest of the property would not have access to that. But if there's a overflow situation because there's not enough parking in the ORD area, then employees can park out in the front portion and still traverse to the back. I'm just trying to understand the bifurcation of it, but.
If I could just.
Sure.
We testified to the condominium units 2 and 3, and the buildings that are on those condominium units are required to use the parking in units 2 and 3 and not on the remaining portions of the property.
Thank you. My other question, sir, you testified that July generally in your research is a lighter month for parking in corporate facilities, research type facilities. Is that correct?
I don't believe that was one testified.
Okay. I apologize. I thought I heard reference that July was relatively, you can be relatively light. Sorry. I heard the number 529.
Correct.
Was that for July 2019 or?
That was.
Okay. What was the number in June 2018?
$483.
So in July, when families are on vacation, children are away, people take time off from work, we saw higher parking counts there in June, which you did clearly testify is a statistically accurate month for testing parking. Would that make you question why did tenants bring in additional, the tenants bring in additional employees, anything related to that? Like, I guess if I was doing parking, I'm not a parking expert, but knowing July is a quiet month, if I saw 483 versus 529, I might say, why is that?
Well, one of the things we found is that while regular employees take summer vacation and go with families, work still needs to be done. And so that is augmented by interns, college staff, and summer hires to supplant those that are on vacation. So for that reason, trends generally balance. I don't know what the occupancy was when I did my counts in June at the 483.
I wasn't aware research companies could bring in a summer help to take over a research project that they've been working on for years. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, Wacek, 13 So let's talk about the study. And so you ran the study, the first sample in June 2018, and then you repeated in July 2019. Did I understand correctly?
Yes, you did.
And we didn't run anything for the whole year in between.
Correct.
Okay. How many similar studies did you perform or oversee in the past 3 years?
This was the only parking study or studies, these two, that I've conducted for this study.
It is the one study, right? With 2 different samples, one in June, one in July. So you performed in the past 3 years, this is the only single study you performed, the parking study you've done.
It's not a single study. We sampled parking twice a day for 5 days in 2018 and 1 day, admittedly, in 2019, just as a litmus test to see if we were still in the general ballpark.
I understand. From the definition of the study, you want to start and you're doing studies up by thousands. So you've done one study in the past 3 years, one parking study.
Although we disagree, I have sampled more than once, but fewer than 100 times.
This was the single study you sampled in June and July over the past 3 years.
That's the purpose of this hearing, it's for this study.
I'm asking all your expertise, have you done other studies like this for other products?
Oh, of course, yes.
In the past years?
Yes.
Okay. And how many of those, how many roughly, do you know, we're talking about 10, I mean, I don't know the exact number, but tens, hundreds?
Over the past 3 years, I would venture to say 50 to 60 different studies.
50 to 60. How many of those were only on the data from June?
Some of them have to be conducted in the middle of summer.
How many roughly?
I would say a smaller sample, but I would say of those 50 or 60, 10% required specific study during the summer.
I have a question for council, because we have a question, one of the questions before, and I don't know if I can ask it, was to, when we asked about will there ever be need to increase the parking spots, and we've been told that the next witness will testify to it. Is it this witness or the next one?
We have another witness that will testify as to the current use of the property, and that it will largely remains the same use, and that will be the next witness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Michelle Smith. I live on Goodhill Road. I have a question, and I know everybody's going back over the June and July, and I appreciate it, but one of the questions I have is when you do a parking study, do you take into account the business that's there currently and their deadlines?
I don't know what you mean by deadlines, but we take into consideration the tenancy as it exists, yes.
Okay, because what I'm asking is for a research and development company, during August and September, they're usually working on grants, government grants to get paid, which come out of the October 1st. So I'm just wondering why research isn't done into what type of business it is and the accountability that they have.
I don't have an answer for that, and I can't corroborate your opinion.
Okay.
Is there any other member of the public that has a question for this witness regarding his testimony? If there is, please step forward, state your name and address.
I'm Walt, 36 Standard. Regarding the study or the snapshot speak, what prevented you guys from taking a monthly snapshot? Or was it just a lack of resource or time constraint?
It's not designed to give us to infinite percentile how close we are with parking. The purpose of doing a snapshot, and candidly to do it over 2 weeks in June, one early week and then going into the next week, was to not come before this board and testify and say, you know, I looked at this parking for one day, here's what I found. So now I've studied it 10 different times over a 2-week period, and I came up with a number. And when I resampled it this past July, I'm still pretty close to the same number. So it tells me that, look, maybe April is 10% higher in terms of parking than June. We have 100% more parking on this site. So we can accommodate whatever marginal seasonal fluctuation there could exist, and I don't think it does. But if I'm wrong, okay, I'm wrong. I can be off by a factor of 100%, and we still have enough parking on this campus to support the variance. So,
in your opinion, it's better to sample 2 weeks at a time as opposed to sampling it once a month or once a quarter or et cetera?
I don't have the luxury, unfortunately, in land use proceedings to come in with a year's worth of data. That seldom presents itself. So we provide a snapshot, and we consult with the applicant, and we look at things like occupancy to make sure that the building was full, and we adjust accordingly. But in my opinion, data that I collected in early June is certainly representative of any other month of the year for an employment-based center. It's not a golf course. It's not a school that might be out for the summer. It's a place where people come to work. And I expect that that trend in early June
is the same as it is every other month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public with a question for this witness? Yes?
Why is this application even before this board as part of this overall thing? Why would we have a separate ownership and a separate parking issue? Why isn't it handled as a separate application?
The reason for this variance request is the technical variance that was identified since we were last before the board and previously testified to variances creating as a result of existing conditions and the zoning of the property. So this was just another variance that was up in our review since we were last before the board.
Application has nothing to do with that part of the property, right? Because the yard-
No, the previous application was actually for the entire property. So we did have testimony previously as to the conditions in the ORD zone and variances in the ORD zone.
Any other questions from the board? From the public? Seeing none. The story at this time, we have our Mr. Troutman, who would like to bring forward.
Okay, we actually have additional witnesses for this variance request. Can we receive those?
I think it would be best, well, Jay, it might be best to hear these witnesses on this variance, that Jay can say. Okay.
Thank you. All right, thank you.
Mr. Coakley will finish the remaining witnesses.
I'd like to call Daniel Lafa. And just, and Councilman, in answer to your question, you know, this application always involved the entirety of this 100-plus acre property, involved these three tax lots, 17, 18, and 19. And we did discuss this very question with board staff before we filed this application. Mr. Lafa, you've been sworn, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So first, just tell the board, what is your professional background?
I am a corporate real estate broker, advisor, and I've been involved in this property since the sale of it. I represented Santa Fe Adventist at the time of the sale of the property to Advance. Prior to selling the property to Advance, we leased 2 buildings in the ORD zone to Ashland Chemical and Kashif Pharma.
Let me just slow you down for a second. So you're a professional real estate broker?
Yeah, I'm the broker of record for Jones Lang LaSalle. We're a Fortune 250 global company. I co-chair our life science practice group. I'm the broker of record in New Jersey, and I'm a Bridgewater High School graduate.
In your capacity as a broker, have you concentrated in office and pharma property?
Yes, both. And the unique thing about this ORD property is that this 800,000 square feet was really designed as laboratory research space, not office space. Out of the roughly 650,000 square feet of net area, there's only one building out of the 10 buildings that's office space. Everything else is lab space.
Are you familiar with the market normally requires parking for office use?
Yes.
What's the ratio of it?
It's normally 3 to 4 per thousand.
And for space like this, do you have a rule of thumb as to what ratio would be appropriate for this type of utilization?
I think the practical ratio is 1 per thousand.
All right, and the Bridgewater ordinance is?
3.3, I believe.
3.3 per thousand.
But that's for office and lab.
All right. So you mentioned a minute ago that you were involved for Santa Fe in the initial sale of the property to, is that the CID?
To Advance.
To Advance, okay. So to
We've also, we represent, go ahead.
So that, when did that happen with you? Approximately 5 or 6 years ago?
Seems like a long time ago, but it's probably 5, 6 years ago.
Okay. And you were also involved in the property when it was sold more recently to Thor?
That's correct.
All right. So were you also involved in leasing property to tenants?
Yes, we lease all of the space that's currently occupied in the ORD zone.
All right, so you're very familiar with how this property is used and who the tenants are?
Yes.
All right. In general, could you describe how this property operates? In general.
Yeah, it's primarily a research and development use. The buildings are specifically designed to function as research space. Nestle Health Sciences operates what they call a pilot plant in the facility, which is predominantly what they call a clinical scale manufacturing research function. So, you know, all the buildings are designed around laboratory research. And as I mentioned, only one of the buildings that Ashland Chemical occupies is an office building.
All right. And would you say that the utilization of research equipment characterizes this type of space?
Yes, typically a scientist will have an office, but will also have a lab. So he moves from his office to his lab, and inside the lab, there's normally a service corridor, and then there's a host of different types of equipment, benchtop equipment, fume hoods, hot and cold boxes, autoclaves, a number of different equipment and functional uses go on in these labs.
And so your basic point is this type of equipment doesn't demand parking, is that fair to say?
Correct.
And you mentioned Nestle, and they have how many square feet?
Roughly 180,000 square feet.
All right, and what about a company called Clinical Genomics?
You know, they're in one of our smaller tenants. They're probably in 15,000 feet.
Okay, PPC Therapeutics.
PTC Therapeutics is a new company to the campus. They're roughly 40,000 square feet.
Would they be similar laboratory type?
They are in JR1, which is 100% a laboratory building.
All right, and Ashland, how much space do they have?
Ashland's in roughly 200,000 feet, 150 of it is lab, and 45 to 50 of it is an office building.
All right, so now, there was some testimony about what is the level of occupancy? Do you have a feeling for that?
That's roughly 90%.
Okay, so that was consistent with Mr. Dean's testimony.
I think we have one floor left in JR1.
That's one of the buildings?
Right. Roughly 40,000 feet.
And you were trying to lease that space?
Correct.
And is the parking on the campus a problem in leasing the space?
No.
There's enough parking?
Enough parking.
No further questions?
Thank you. Does any member of the board have a question for this witness regarding his testimony? Mr. Lerner, go ahead.
Is converting a lab building to an office building in one of these feasible? Should somebody come in and decide they want to change the use?
Not really. Most of these buildings are designed with service corridors and loading docks, and mechanically, the HVAC equipment, it's designed for once-through air. So to operate these buildings is about twice as much as it is to operate an office building, to give you a sense.
So your testimony is that it would be very expensive to...
Now, the highest and best use is the R&D that goes on there right now.
Any other member of the board?
Is it accurate to state that of the 650,000 square feet, 600,000 is research and 50,000 is office?
There is some pockets of office space inside each of the lab buildings, but it's minimal.
So what percentage of the 650,000 is office space?
10 to 15%.
Any other member of the board? Is there any member of the public with a question for this witness regarding his testimony? Please come forward.
Good evening, Matthew Mensch, 1303 Roger Avenue. I had a question, I guess for Mr. Collins. I didn't hear whether this witness was actually sworn in as an expert. I've heard
No,
testimony that
he
sounded
wasn't.
so given that, Mr. Collins, I would suggest to you that all the testimony is nothing but an opinion that hasn't been backed up by either expertise or a finding by this board, or some sort of facts to back that up. So that's it. I'm not sure what value this testimony has.
Mr. Cook, you want to address that?
Let me offer Mr. Laughlin as an expert in the field of commercial brokerage for research and development and lab type properties.
And Mr. Mensch, would you like to quadrille him as to those qualifications? Asking questions as to those qualifications.
Yeah, no, I don't have any, well, back it up. Sir, can you give us the benefit of your background? I heard you from West. I was from when it was still combined, so West East when I was there.
Yeah, so I'm in the business 33 years. I represented Hoffman LaRoche in the sale of their Nutley campus. I represent Merck in the sale of their Union, Summit, and White House headquarters. I currently represent Bristol Myers Squibb in the disposition of their 1.2 million square foot campus in Hopewell, which we just signed a lease with PTC Therapeutics there as well for 200,000 feet. So this is what I do. You know, as I mentioned, I co-chair our life science practice group nationally for JLL.
Understood. Where did you go to school, sir? What, after West, where did you go?
Long Island University.
Okay. What did you get a degree in there?
Business.
Okay. I don't have any objections to this witness being qualified as an expert in the subject matter with which Mr. Coakley has offered him for. But Mr. Collins, I still object to the fact that nothing that I've heard so far would indicate to me that this is a witness who can testify regarding the sufficiency of parking to the extent that this witness has. We've heard from engineers, we've heard from somebody with 33 years of experience in parking. I don't understand what somebody who is what sounds to be a relatively experienced broker in this field is going to be able to tell us about the sufficiency of parking under our ordinances and whether or not this meets the criteria for planning purposes as to whether or not there is in fact a valid parking here. There's nothing in his experience or background that suggests that that testimony is included within his scope as an expert witness.
I don't determine what the value to an applicant is of their witness. And Mr. Coakley has presented him. What he presented for is up to Mr. Coakley. And if you want to make a statement later about what you think of the probative value of this witness, you could do that, but you can't do it when you're cross-examining a witness. But you might be able to elicit something from him on this subject that would help your cause. I think it's clear that he is an expert in real estate. So,
Understood.
Okay. You agree, so.
I don't have
Mr. Coakley's expert is that he's an expert.
Yes, with that I don't disagree. Sir, could you just clarify for me and for the audience, what if any is your current role with regard to this site?
We are currently the leasing agents on behalf of Thor Equities, the currently new owner.
And you've been involved with the site continuously from the time it was first sold?
Yes.
I asked a witness earlier if we didn't know, but can you provide for us information with regard to what, if any, what new tenants, if any, have come onto the site within the past 5 years?
Past 5 years, all of them.
So anything that existed prior to that time, it was a completely different site prior to approximately 5 or 6 years ago?
You know, I think the way Santa Fe designed and built the site and the parking that they allocated for it is what we're using now. It's the same use.
But my question is, anything that predates about 5 or 6 years ago was the single-use Santa Fe site as opposed to what we currently have. So comparisons to looking at the site 10 years ago towards now is two completely different sites.
You know, the front of the site was always office space. The back of the site is the ORD site. And that's why it's been bifurcated, because that's what the highest and best uses for the back portion of the site.
Thank you, I don't have any questions.
All right, thanks.
Hello, I'm Ross Stander, 662 Cedarbrook Road, Bridgewater, also chairman of the Crisis Environmental Group for the last 30 years or so. We've been dealing with the Perkins sediment site. You may be aware from past that there's a very high degree of benzene.
Mr. Stander, you have to ask.
I'm going to ask the question.
That's all you can do.
One more sentence and I'll ask the question, sir.
No, you can't make a statement.
All right, I will.
You can ask this witness a question related to this vote.
Witness, can you tell us which of the companies, Sanofi, Ashland, etc., is responsible for the high degree of benzene contamination under this site?
I'm not aware of it.
Well, we are.
The witness doesn't know anything to answer your question, so you have to
Thank you.
focus on what he testified about.
Hello, Andy Fresco, Glen Eagles Drive, Bridgewater. So, Mr. Laughlin, do you still live in Bridgewater?
No, I live in North Branch.
Okay, yeah. I'm an East guy, actually. And I do live in Bridgewater still, 40 years, as do my parents. Okay, so, can you tell us what % of this ORD portion is occupied by Nestle? Do you know roughly? You know, sorry.
That's the entire JR2 building.
Exactly, and it is a Nestle pilot program, right?
Yeah.
You're aware of that, okay?
Yeah.
So the nature of a pilot program is it's a test, right?
It's research, yes.
Okay, but it's not like it's Nestle candy bars or water or things that we're familiar with. It is R&D. So what would you say the likelihood was that they are even here in 5 years?
I think it's actually Nestle Nutritional Health Sciences is the name of the entity. And it's all about nutrition and pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals meeting each other. So I think they're going to be here for a while.
Okay, good, because the press release that I read, said that it implied that it was a new program that they were investing and exploring.
They signed a 17-year lease.
17 years, okay, all right, well, good, that's helpful. Sir, how many times have you testified on behalf of a client, I suppose, for a parking variance?
Not often. This is actually my second testimony in the last 2 months.
Okay, so then I think we can call into question then, no offense, of course, I'm not an attorney, but this isn't really your thing. I mean, you're a realtor. I mean, you sell high-end realtor?
Yeah, so you really can't, finalize a lease without addressing parking. Parking is, a key component of any lease transaction.
That's right. So you haven't seen a lot of this, and you're saying, I'm asking, this is the only time, just to clarify, that you've ever had to testify on behalf of a client for a
In front of
parking
the
variance.
board that this kind of setting.
Do you think it's fair, sir, that businesses in Bridgewater all have to adhere to this ordinance, yet this applicant is asking for a variance? Do you think it's fair to the other businesses?
Objection.
He's not an expert, he's giving his opinion. I think that's a...
If you could just direct your questions to his testimony, that would be helpful.
I own a business nearby. I don't think it's
Have to ask
fair.
the question.
You think it's fair? Okay, that's fine. I think we all agree it's not fair to any of the other businesses in this corridor.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public with a question for this witness regarding his testimony? Please come forward.
Hi, my name is Michelle Smith. I just have a couple of different questions. You indicated that it's a research and manufacturing plant, Nestle.
No, research and pilot plant.
No, you used the word manufacturing.
Clinical scale manufacturing, which is a kind of a research function.
Okay, because living in this area, I'm sure you grew up and that company was where Sanofi is, where there's contamination in the ground. That was my first question. My second question is, in the past, you in advance have had testimony and administered when I lived there about solar panel plants. Is that still an issue that's going to be reviewed?
I'm not aware of that. I wasn't involved in that.
Yeah.
You are, okay, so we're 2 for 2, thank you.
Is there another member with a question?
Paweł Placek, 13 Drive. It might be related to testimony, so I apologize, but this testimony was offered as answering the question whether there will be future requests for the parking increase. So I wanted to ask which part of your testimony proves that point, that there will not be future requests for additional parking?
That was his testimony at all, to this statement, this characterization of his testimony, and it should not be allowed. What we've said repeatedly is if they come in for a new building, then it comes before the board, but that's not the case here. Where this application is based on the existing buildings, the existing parking. It seeks a variance based on those two existing conditions.
I agree with the statement.
You have to just ask questions.
I understand.
And you can ask them, and then if there's an objection because it's outside the scope of the direct testimony, we'll have to decide that, but go ahead and ask questions, but don't make statements, don't try to tell him what he's supposed to tell you. Ask him what you want to hear and see if he answers it.
I understand that, and I don't have a question for because
Then you're done. If you don't have any questions, you can't speak at this stage because this witness is just open for questions. But if you do have a question and it's within the scope of his direct testimony, ask. And ask him, and then if there's an objection, we'll deal with it.
okay. I have a question for council then, when there's the time comes.
They don't have to answer questions. Council, they might answer questions, but they don't have to. So if you're saying that you would like to ask Mr. Coakley a question, maybe you want to ask him that during the break. Okay?
No, it wasn't. We asked the question first.
I understand your point, but that's a statement. Just go ahead and ask your question.
Is there any other member of the public with a question for this witness regarding his testimony?
Jay Gardner, 31 Bridge Street. You've made some great deals in the pharmaceutical industry. You've been involved in most of the big ones. We've heard a lot about 93% occupancy, right? But that's really the tenants. Or that's like if we could take 10 tenants there, we have 9 tenants now. Do I understand that correctly?
No, I think what 90% occupancy means is that 90% of the space is committed to by leases.
Right. So is there a restriction in the lease? Does the lease spell out how many people they can have in there, or is there a restriction in the lease on that?
Not necessarily, but it's usually based on the current plan of the building and the use of the building, which is for RD functions.
Yeah, I understand the use. Okay. Thank you.
Garage Angle in Brookfield Avenue. I'm also an industry man myself, so I've been in a few sites all in New Jersey. What can you tell us about any studies or analyses or your expert opinion on transient traffic that's different from R&D facilities like this versus an office building? So as an example, there's things that are transient across all office parks, right? Snow piles up, you can't park there. Then there are ones that are more specific to R&D facilities. So if you think about the cooling trucks that have to come in, the chemical trucks that have to come in, so they're a lot different than a WB Mason, or just has to drop off office supplies. So what can you tell us about this that's different, and was that accounted for in the parking analyses that were done for this?
There's several liquid nitrogen tanks on the property, but they're designed and already approved, when they were built.
Well, no, it's not that. So I mean, so there's transient traffic, meaning there's like when the previous gentleman spoke, he was talking about, they had looked at, I guess, how the parking was occupied by workers there. What about delivery trucks and other sorts of parties that have to come and go, which are greater need for an R&D facility versus an office building because they've got to drop off chemicals, they have to stay there longer. So I don't know how many of them show up in summertime.
I mean, we're 90% occupied, and each building has its own separate loading areas dedicated for loading.
I just want folks to be aware, again, speaking from personal experience, we kind of had that issue.
By this stage, right, and then it's open to the public for testimony, you'll be able to make statements.
Okay.
My name is Mike Terry. I am a resident of 1048 Route 202, right across the street. Just a question for you because I think the timeline with the 90% occupancy has been coming into question a bit. Did Mr. Dean's organization contact you? You seem to have a lot of understanding of tenants that are in the building, the square footage that has been occupied, the timeline of the occupation of that square footage. Has his firm worked with yours at all to determine, although leases may have been in effect, what occupancy or what tenants were actually occupying the buildings that were under lease?
They didn't consult me, but I assume they consult the owner of the building, Advance and Thorne.
Well, he already said he didn't do that, so that's why I'm asking you if he contacted you about it. Because the second question I have is there has been probably over 30% of that space, that commercial space of that 800,000 square footage offered for lease on commercial real estate platforms. And from my perspective as a resident, that to me means that you have some tenants that are leaving, tenants that are coming in, especially over the last 2-year period. Some of these listings, at least 250,000 square foot of these listings have been up since 2018.
So actually before that.
Before that, it's about 2 years, yeah.
Marketing the property, but.
And they're represented by JLL, which is your
Yeah, which is us, right, and, we've signed, I don't know how many square feet, but maybe 150,000 feet of leases in the last year.
And what is the typical turnaround time after a lease is executed to where, you have, obviously one company is not doing the exact same thing as another. They have to come in, they have to reconfigure the building, airlines, whatever. What is the typical turnaround time between a lease being executed and somebody entering and occupying fully their business?
These buildings are so well equipped with Santa Fe left behind. Most of the tenants, other than Nestle, had to do a lot of work with their pilot plant, but most of the tenants have actually just moved in and used a lot of the equipment and the furniture and other things that were left behind by Santa Fe. Everybody's different, but predominantly most of them have just moved right in fairly quickly after the lease is signed.
So is that fairly quickly, relatively speaking?
60, 90 days.
60, 90 days. So during the last 2 years, would you say that about 30% of that space that is available in total, that 800,000, would have been in transitional periods?
No, I think, we've leased 150,000 feet in the last year, and once they sign the lease, they're occupying in 90 days.
That's understood. So my question there would be, you said 150,000 square feet, okay? That's, without a calculator, that's about 20% of the size of the property in the last year. And Mr. Dean's readings were taken in June 5th of 2018, which is a year ago. Okay, so now you have 20% of the total square footage of the property that was unused within the last year or in transition. And now you go from, I don't want to put you on the spot for what Mr. Dean said because I can't get you guys here together. But Mr. Dean alleges that although his number of parking spaces that were actually used went up from July of 2019 to from June of 2018, he doesn't see that whole summer month thing to be any type of alarming to him because in his essence, his first numbers, which he took when the properties were all in transition or listed as being available, those numbers he took are now being replicated by a summer month in July. So my question to you would be, and this is based on your expert opinion, those numbers going up during the timeline of these companies coming in and occupying space, would you argue that that is an increase in occupancy that is driving up those numbers from June 2018?
I mean, if more people are moving in from 2018 to 2019, there should be more cars parked there.
So would Mr. Dean's numbers then being apples to oranges, because the tendency, he argues the occupancy in 2018 was 93%. You argue that you've leased 150,000 square footage of space in the last year.
Last year, from 2018.
So that 7% occupancy, 150,000 square feet, you would agree is 20% occupancy, correct?
This is much more appropriate for making a statement or argument.
I'm not allowed to make a statement now, sir.
Asking a witness.
The objection is correct. You have to focus your attention on questions of this witness, and that does allow you to make a preface to a question, but not to make an argumentative statement to the witness.
I haven't made a statement. I've been asking questions of this man. He's been answering them, which I appreciate. Thank you. So my last question then is, from the date that, let's say June 5th, 2018, not even referencing Mr. Dean's numbers that he came up with earlier, from that date until now, you have leased at least 100,000 square footage of space.
I don't know the exact number of square footage.
You seem to.
In that realm.
You seem to. You seem to have a very good understanding of
My
this.
position is that it's one space per 1,000 square feet that gets leased for lab space. It's kind of the practical rule of thumb, in my opinion.
Understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
Timothy Rain, 17 Lund Road. Sir, out of all of the buildings in the ORD zone, what is the total occupancy load as rated by the fire or construction official in the town?
I don't know.
Okay. Are you aware of anyone that would know?
I would think the owners and the property managers might know.
Okay. So then you're not aware of anyone that would have looked at that, that you're aware of, that would have looked at that as to how many occupants are allowed. Like this room's allowed 254 people in it. If we added that up for all the buildings, no one that
Each tenant gets their own individual certificate of occupancy, which I believe addresses those issues.
I understand. I'm just trying to understand if anybody's looked at, there was testimony earlier about additional people moving in. We don't know if that may or may not happen, but if there's, and I'm sure you would agree, if the town gives Nestle, it says out of your total space, your load occupancy on each floor is 200 people times however many floors, Nestle theoretically needs that number of parking spaces. When you do sign your leases, is there any commitment to each tenant as to how many parking spaces they get?
You give them like a pro rata share.
So it is spelled out in the lease?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, but not
Varies.
always. Okay. So potentially, if somebody could come in with more people based upon the occupancy load, they could need more parking. Possibly.
You know, if somebody changed the buildings to another use.
Without changing, because we don't know if anybody's actually looked at the occupancy loads that the town is
So I
serving.
think you have the COs do that.
Okay, but, all right, not overall for the project.
I'm sorry?
Not overall for the project.
I believe each tenant they have to have their own certificate of occupancy.
But nobody overall for the project. For the ORD area, collectively.
I don't know, that's not something I'm aware of.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there any other member of the public with a question for this witness? Mary Hayes?
I have a question. Thank you. So, in short, so your testimony that availability or inavailability of parking has never been a problem in leasing the space.
That's correct.
And that the use of this space tends to drive the parking requirement. Correct?
That's correct.
And then lastly, you're saying that the use of this space or the volume of this space is not likely to change for years to come.
I don't see it. I mean, we leased 800,000 feet at this park, roughly.
So,
It's successful.
so in your opinion, parking as it has been, is the parking as it will be,
Suitable.
is not going to be an impact in your ability to rent the space? Thank you.
Is there any other questions from the public? Seeing none, thank you. At this time, I'd like to take a 5-minute recess. We will reconvene. That clock is fast on the wall in the back. So I have 9:27, so we'll reconvene in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hey, how are you? Hey, how are you?
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Copeland, is your next witness?
Yes, Paul Phillips. He's been previously sworn. He's been previously qualified by this board as an expert witness in the field of land use planning. I offer him as such.
Yes, Mr. Phillips, you understand you're still under oath?
I do, Mr. Collins.
Thank you. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Mr. Phillips, have you heard the testimony this evening of the 3 prior witnesses? I have. All right. And you're familiar with the project you testified about this property previously, have you not? I have. All right. And based on that, do you have an opinion as to whether or not the criteria of the Land Use Act for a variance like this have been satisfied? I do. All right. What is that opinion?
So, what we're here for this evening is a parking variance, essentially due to the proposal to change the configuration of the entrance drive to the ORD campus. There's going to be a net loss of 22 parking spaces. The decrease will be from 1,190, which currently exists, to 1,168 as proposed as part of the current application. The Bridgewater ordinance requires 2,183 spaces based on a ratio of 1 space per 300 square feet of floor area. The planning board has heard from both Mr. Dean and Mr. Laughlin. I believe they have each made compelling arguments in support of the variance relief. In terms of the planning basis for the parking variance, I believe the key considerations are as follows. And first, Mr. Collins brought this up, and perhaps this is more a point of information, but the planning board did previously grant a variance, a parking variance, back in 2008, which was for the then entire 110-acre Santa Fe campus. And that variance was to allow as many as 655 fewer spaces than was required by ordinance. So the board back in 2008 recognized that there was a basis to relax the ordinance with regard to parking, and at least for the Santa Fe R&D use which existed on the property roughly 10 years ago. I will also point out, I read that resolution from 2008. There was already a parking variance that had previously been granted to Santa Fe, which is cited in that 2008 resolution. There was actually a parking variance originally granted to Santa Fe back in 2000. So at least 2 instances, the parking standard was relaxed in connection with applications involving the full 110-acre Santa Fe application. Second, the R&D or the ORD portion of the campus, as you've heard, is now almost fully leased, so there's a reliable base of information regarding the type of tenants, the space utilization, and the actual parking demands. So what we now know is that most of the space is leased for research and development and laboratory type activities, which typically do not generate as many employees on a per square foot basis as compared to strictly office use. And by way of example, and you heard this from Mr. Laughlin, you have certain amounts of floor area that are devoted to things such as the clinical trials for the product manufacturing. You have incidental storage. You have a lot of specialized equipment for the R&D and lab type use. None of these type of uses on their own generate any or very little parking demand. I would also concur with the testimony of Mr. Laughlin that in many of these facilities, scientists often have their own office and lab space, which essentially provides a more generous amount of space on a per employee basis. Now, Mr. Dean's parking counts indicate that only about half of the available supply is likely to be occupied based on the current tenant mix, and his basically upping that figure to an 100% occupancy rate. I think it was at 93% when he did the study, but he basically upped that to 100%. I calculated on a square foot basis, that amounts to about one space for every 1,150 square feet. That's the empirical evidence of parking based on Mr. Dean's counts. The proposed parking supply on the site in the ORD zone is at a rate of one space per 560 square feet. So essentially, there's double the amount of available parking in ORD as compared to what the empirical counts basically indicate. I will also offer for you, since I've been doing this a long time, I've drafted zoning ordinances, I've reviewed zoning ordinances. I will say that with regard to parking ratios for research and development and lab use throughout the state, if you look at zoning ordinances, I will acknowledge that they are all over the map. They are all over the map. I will also say that, based on my experience, that the Bridgewater requirement of one space per 300 square feet is highly conservative. Interestingly, Bridgewater basically has the same parking ratio for research lab type use as it does for office use. This is atypical, and it is, quite frankly, onerous, all else being equal. Just to give you some example, and I've seen other municipalities with a 1 per 300. You're not the only one out there with 1 per 300. But more typically, you find standards, you can see 1 per 500. I've seen 1 per 800. I've seen 1 per 1,000 for this type of use. Importantly, notwithstanding the existing conditions, I think the fact that the actual parking demand, parking supply rather, is still roughly double what the most recent empirical evidence shows in terms of demand or need, will provide appropriate safeguards for the site and ultimately for the municipality, even if the tenant mix changes over time, which is obviously something that can happen, notwithstanding the fact that there may be long-term leases on this property. But the key, I think, is what Mr. Loughlin mentioned, which is that you have to understand that these buildings have been basically designed for research and development and lab type use with very little office space that goes hand in hand with that predominant use. So I think, as a practical matter, considering that this R&D space has been used this way historically, it's been proposed this way, I think there's basically little or virtually no chance that there's going to be a parking issue in the future on this site, based upon what those how those buildings have been designed and how they've historically been used. I think the parking variance could be granted on both C1 and C2 grounds. With regard to the former, I think the strict application of the parking standard does present some practical difficulty for this applicant, as again, the generic ordinance standard of 1 per 300 would require this applicant to construct significantly greater parking than is actually needed based on the evidence. I also believe that to ask this applicant to construct what I characterize as unnecessary parking would add new paved surfaces to the site. And I would note that in the ORD portion of the development as proposed, the applicant is well below the allowable improved lot coverage at this point. So in that sense, I think the benefits that would be gained basically by allowing these areas to stay as green space in terms of aesthetics, keeping within the coverage, well below the coverage requirement, and also basically providing or not having the applicant have to go provide additional stormwater management to service these unnecessary paved areas without substantially outweigh any detriments associated with the variance relief. I think a number of purposes of the statute would be advanced. I think purpose A, which is to guide development in a manner that promotes the public welfare. Purposes C and J which is basically have to do with providing adequate open space, promoting open space, and purpose M, which is to encourage a more efficient use of the land. And lastly, as there will still be roughly double the amount of parking available relative to the current demand, I would see no substantial detriment to the public good or substantial impairment of the zoning plan and zoning ordinance if this variance is granted.
No further questions.
Thank you. Is there any member of the board who has a question for this witness regarding this testimony?
Give us the numbers. You said there's other towns that use 300 square foot. Do you know offhand who they are?
I don't know offhand, but I will state that I am familiar with other ordinances that are as low as the 1 per 300. But again, the point I was trying to make is I think planners basically don't have a good handle on what the right standard is, and I think Bridgewater has probably been very, very conservative in that regard, which is why we're here requesting the variance relief. Other towns are not so conservative, and they're more in line, which I think is more the empirical demand, which is that anywhere maybe from 1 per 500 to 1 per 1,000.
Is there any member of the public with a question for this witness regarding this testimony?
Good evening, Andy Fresco, 15 Glen Eagles Drive. Sir, I can't, you guys, man, you guys, you can't blame me for trying. Sir, in 2008, sir, was there a retail component on this parcel?
No.
Okay, sir, in 2008, were there 400 apartments being applied for?
No.
Sir, in 2008, that's
Yeah, you are way beyond the scope of the direct testimony, sir.
It's one application, correct?
It's one application, but this is not about the commercial parking or the condominium parking at all.
The residents of Bridgewater are concerned that this is on the same parcel of land. Come on.
The only testimony by this witness tonight is about the ORD parking variance for the buildings that exist there now.
I understand.
So you can ask questions that try to focus on that subject, but you can't focus on something, they're not even asking for relief on the parking.
Right.
So.
But it has to be considered, sir, that
No, it does not.
years ago,
In other words, there's already been a hearing about the parking for the
Fair enough.
commercial.
I yield, sir. Okay. So, sir, in 2008, was there a parking garage adjacent to this property, which is, and I'm alluding to the parking garage at the Indian Temple? Was that?
You're talking about something off-site?
That's right.
I have no idea.
Okay, it was not. Sir, do you think that the planning board should consider this when making a decision about the retail component? I'm just asking you if you think.
What do you mean by this?
This is this variance request.
No.
Sir, I just want you to tell me if you can identify what, for the record, this is an overhead map of the applicant's ceiling. Okay, so I just want to make sure you can see that. And let the record show that this property is surrounded.
Or you have to try to answer a question. You can preface a question,
okay,
and you can show him something. You can ask him if he recognizes an
I don't want to waste time, so I want to get through it quickly. That's all. I'm just trying to move quickly. Sir, do you see any other ORDs in that image?
Well, this is an aerial map that shows basically the existing uses on the ground. It doesn't show overlay zoning, but what I will say is it appears to show a portion of the subject property as well as certain surrounding areas which look to be largely residential.
Largely residential. That's correct, sir. And that's why Bridgewater has a very strict ordinance about the 1-300. Is because we don't want unnecessary parking lots in our residential communities. No further.
Good evening, Matthew Mensch, 1303 Roger Avenue. Sir, would you mind describing for the board and the audience what the conditions of the site were in 2008? I'm talking about the entire site, sir.
Yeah, the site was basically one campus, 110 acres, and included the buildings which are still part of the rear R&D campus, and the buildings in the front of the campus which have subsequently been placed within the RC zone.
Okay. And do you know in 2008, at that time specifically, was the building still occupied, or was it the campus still occupied at that time, or was it vacant? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I believe it was, but I can't tell you with any accuracy how much may have been vacant at the time.
And so we talked about 2008. The current proposal for the site is significantly different than existed in 2008, correct? There was no hotels proposed in 2008?
Yeah, the front portion of the site as part of this overall proposal is consistent with the change in the land use designation for the front portion of the property, correct?
No residential component in 2008?
I don't believe so.
Again, this has nothing to do with the residential application.
Sure. Mr. Collins, we've heard now testimony, we heard quasi-testimony from counsel earlier. We've now heard testimony tonight from this witness regarding a 2008 planning board waiver regarding parking, which the witness specifically indicated was for the entire site. So therefore, if they're trying to use the waiver in 2008 as some sort of precedent for this board to grant this parking waiver, we should be entitled to delve into what the conditions were in 2008 and what was predicated in that 2008 waiver and how it relates to this current site. Because if the two sites aren't the same, then the testimony...
Go right ahead and ask the questions, but keep it focused on the direct.
Sure. So just to make sure the record's complete, I believe, I'm not repetitive, but there was no residential component in 2008?
That's correct.
No retail in 2008?
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay. So the parking waiver that you referenced earlier in 2008, that was for the entire site, you testified, correct, sir?
Correct.
Did you review the submissions before the board in 2008 to understand the dynamics of the parking application at that time?
I reviewed only the resolution and the magnitude of the variance relief as I so testified this evening.
And that magnitude was for the entire 110 acre site?
Correct.
Did you look at what, if any, discussion occurred at the board with regard to that parking waiver in 2008 as it applies to the back portion of the now designated ORD zone?
I only reviewed the resolution, and again, the resolution and the parking relief went with the entirety of the site.
Okay. So, to answer my question, you did not review whether there were any comments at the time that that board passed the resolution in 2008 that dealt with parking or traffic specifically in this section of the site?
When you say comments?
Well, there's board discussion when...
as I mentioned, I only reviewed the resolution of approval, granting the parking variance.
Okay. You didn't review any submissions, parking reports, traffic studies, parking studies in 2008?
If there was, I didn't review them.
Okay. Was there a fence up in 2008? We've heard discussion about the security fence.
I can't answer that with 100% certainty. I wasn't here, I didn't participate in that application, so I'm not going to delve into that.
Okay. Last question on this topic, do you know whether or not the flow of traffic within the site in 2008 was unencumbered, or was there some barrier that stopped cars from getting to this back portion of the site compared to the front?
Again, I didn't study specifically the internal flows as part of 2008. I focused on the parking variance relief that was granted by the board.
Understood. You testified tonight about, you gave some conclusions regarding your opinion of parking and sufficiency of parking. Did you conduct any independent analysis with regard to occupancy of the buildings?
No.
Did you use Mr. Dean's figures or Mr. Laughlin's figures? Or did you use any figures in terms of, whose figures did you use?
Well, the testimony that I provided in terms of the existing parking ratios were based on Mr. Dean's report.
You heard the testimony earlier this evening?
I was here the whole evening, yes.
Did you hear testimony from Mr. Laughlin? I apologize if I'm not saying that right to the witness, but did you hear testimony from that witness about the amount of retail space that has been, or amount of space, I should say, that has been leased between 2018 and 2019?
I heard the testimony, yes.
Okay. Do you have any opinion with regard to whether or not the figures that Mr. Dean offered for consideration and the testimony of Mr. Laughlin are compatible?
Well, I think they are based on what I heard from Mr. Dean. With Mr. Dean, if I understand his testimony correctly, his count from 2019 basically supported his counts from 2018. There was very little change in the existing parking demand over the course of that time frame, which is, as I understand the time frame, which Mr. Laughlin testified as regard to leasing of space.
We heard some testimony that suggested there was a significant amount of space leased within 2018-2019, which would suggest that either we're at a higher occupancy than 93% now, or we were at a lower occupancy in 2018. Do you agree with that, sir?
What I based my testimony on was Mr. Dean's report that his time of his counts, there was 93% occupancy.
Understood. What's the, can you provide some explanation as to what exactly is the change in the entranceway that's predicating the reduction of the 24 spots?
I mean, I'm familiar with it, but I really defer any specifics to Mr. Herman. I know the general area where it's located, which is basically here, but he would have to bring up the site plan to kind of go through the actual loss of parking and where it is. I'll defer to him on those specifics as the site engineer.
Right. What, are you able to provide any testimony as to where the entranceway or how that road would be configured if you weren't permitted to eliminate those 24 parking spots?
No, I didn't review that or study that at all.
More broadly, if the planning board was to require you to comply with the ordinance as it stands right now, what would the impact be on the application?
The board could deny the application, obviously. And I think you heard from another witness that should there be a need for additional parking, there may be areas on the site that presently aren't improved. But again, I didn't independently study that.
Have you seen any data from anybody else that would indicate what would happen, what buildings might have to be taken down or changed to site configuration?
No.
Okay. Sir, you talked about a C1 variance, and you went through some discussion about why you thought that the current number of ratio of the ordinance is really too high for the use of the site, correct?
Yes.
And C1 is a hardship variance?
C1 is hardship.
So I guess my question to you, sir, is the predicate of the C1 hardship variance is not could the number be less than what it is, but the applicant first has the burden of proving that there is in fact a hardship to them that would otherwise get to the second phase, which is could it be reduced. But how do we get to whether there's a hardship to the applicant if nobody here, including yourself, has testified to what the hardship would be to the applicant, since nobody has studied what would the impact of the site be for the parking spaces, what changes would have to be made, or what the alternative plan would be for the parking spaces?
You don't, in my professional opinion, have to provide those proofs to basically put forth the hardship argument in the MLUL. If you can basically demonstrate that there is a unique or extraordinary situation affecting a particular property, and here I think we have that. We have a built condition. We have an established parking area. We're only talking about the net loss of 22 parking spaces here. We have a history of the use, and we have prior precedent where variances were granted for similar uses on the entirety of the site, albeit 10 years ago, which indicate to me that the strict application of that 1 per 300 standard as applied to this unique particular property, given its context, would result in practical difficulties for this applicant.
Certainly, the board at some point will make their conclusions on that. Except, you know, what I have not heard from you, sir, is I still, in my reading of the language, require a hardship, and I have not yet heard what hardship, if any, actually applies to this applicant. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
I almost just said good morning. Good afternoon, or good evening, I guess. All the way.
The hours just go by quickly.
It's been quite a day. Jeffrey Brookner, 60 Nicole Terrace in Bridgewater. I have a series of questions. You've mentioned the rezoning of the property from the front part of the property to the RC, the newly designed RC development. When the Township Council did that impact the buildings that can be built legally in the back of the property behind the fence that you're talking about?
I'm not sure I understand what cases of your question.
The RC zoning impacted what can be built in the front of the property.
Correct.
And all of the stuff about the ability to build a hotel, the ability to build apartments and retail and the supermarket, all of that came from the ordinance that the Township Council passed creating the RC district. My question is, did that ordinance also impact what can be built in the, getting the name, the ORD zone?
Well, it did to the extent that it reduced the land area within what was part of the ORD zone. So any zoning requirement that goes with land area, whether it's floor area ratio, how much you build, what the coverage is, all of those kind of things are obviously affected because there's less land. But basically, basically all the buildings existed at the time that zone line was created, which are now still left within the ORD zone portion.
So the existing number of spaces, is that number, I believe it's 1190, I believe it was?
It's 1190 right now,
Is
in
that-
the ORD.
In the ORD, is that a pre-existing condition that's grandfathered in your understanding?
Well, it's an interesting legal question. I'm going to defer to counsel, but obviously the governing body decided to put the line where the line was. There was an existing parking variance that went with the whole site. The fact that now we have a lesser amount of land area within ORD, I don't know how that dovetails with the prior variance, so I'm not so sure it's I characterize it as a pre-existing non-condition, but I'll defer to learned counsel on that.
Understood. I guess the point I'm making is that the situation that exists with the parking is not because all of a sudden there's an actual shortfall in parking. It's because all of a sudden the property was rezoned.
Not entirely, because remember, when you looked at the entirety of the site, the 110 acres, there was a significant parking variance that was granted back in 2008 to the tune of 655 spaces. So I don't know exactly what those ratios are. The resolution of approval didn't basically provide the square footage of the entire campus at the time. But clearly, the parking standard that went part and parcel with that variance back in 2008 provided for a much more relaxed parking standard than the 1 per 300 which exists. And obviously, on the site now, being the ORD campus, the existing parking ratio also is short of that 1 per 300 standard.
Fair enough. Last question. All of the development that's being talked about in this application for the front of the property, the hotel, the apartments, all of that, it's my understanding, and I just want you to confirm this, your testimony has nothing to do with any of that. And your testimony is here today.
Correct.
So you have previously provided testimony, and you may again provide testimony at a later date on the parking for the other property. That's completely separate from what we're talking about here today.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Rafael Golding, Garfield Avenue. Just so I can make sure my questions are focused, can you please just recap your scope here? But your role here and responsibility, just so I'm not keeping my questioning.
I'm a professional planner, and I've provided testimony in support of the parking variance on the ORD portion of the site, hopefully consistent with the statutory proofs for saying.
How certain are you that you're correct? I'm not being facetious.
I'm highly confident that I'm correct.
Close to 100%.
I'm highly confident. You can put whatever percentage you want on that. I'm highly confident that I'm correct.
With that degree of certitude, would you say that an OBA outcomes-based agreement would help grease the wheels of the process?
I'm not familiar with that terminology.
So very common in the healthcare manufacturing industry. I myself put together a lot of these. I'm not offering my services. I'm just saying. So basically, if you're correct, then and the variance gets approved, then you get what you're looking for. If you're incorrect, then in a lot of these outcomes-based agreements, and there's precedent for this outside of Bridgewater, that the applicant would then pay recurring fees for that. So that's an outcomes-based agreement. It satisfies both parties, because then if you're right, you get what you want, but if you're incorrect, then is that something that...
I can't address that.
That is a question that has nothing to do with this testimony.
Yes, if you could please focus your questions on his testimony, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was it, thank you.
Thank you.
So, quick question so I understand just the numbers. It will be easy for me. The current ordinance is one parking spot for 300 square feet.
Correct.
Okay, and you cited the relief to ordinance in 2008. Do you remember the ratio? The ratio of the relief. I mean, you said there was like a significant relief of the spaces.
I don't know, because the resolution that I reviewed didn't basically list the total square footage of the entire 110-acre campus. It just gave the magnitude of the parking variance, which was 655 spaces.
Does anyone know the ratio? What was it, the relief of the ordinance in 2008?
I just indicated, without knowing what the total square footage was, I can't do that calculation. Maybe Scarlett or someone has that, I don't.
Okay, but 650 of the total number is probably, you had a lesser relief in 2008 that you're asking right now. How much bigger relief are you asking right now compared to 2008?
Yeah, I can't answer that without knowing what the square footage was. The only other thing which I think is somewhat pertinent to the 2008 is that, as opposed to the rear existing campus, whereas you heard from Mr. Loughlin that the bulk of the space is R&D and only about 10 to 15% office, there was more office space in that front portion of the premises back in 2008. So it may not be an apples and apples comparison, even if we did know the total square footage. We might want to also potentially investigate how that space was broken down. But again, I can't do the calculation.
I mean, for the record, I would like to understand it, because we were missing 650 for the total campus. Right now, we're missing almost 1,000 or over 1,000 for a much smaller portion of it. So the relief ask, the ratio, we were asking is much greater than it was in 2008.
Well, I don't know that. You may or may not be right. But again, the point of my bringing up the 2008 approval is basically to indicate to the board and the public that for an R&D, largely R&D use, even back in 2008, the board saw fit to basically grant relief from that 1 per 300 square foot standard, which I think is a highly conservative, if not onerous standard for R&D type use, as opposed to exclusively or predominantly office use. That was my point.
So last question. So what's the ratio we're asking for relief for right now?
So the parking requirement is 1 per 300, and I've calculated the proposed parking supply at a rate of 1 space per 560.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Is there any member of the public with a question for this witness?
Jay Gardner, 31 Ray Street. I'm confused about what variance, what ordinance are you looking for a variance to? So is it the 126-169? Okay, and you're looking for a variance of, help me, what's the variance that you're looking for here?
So we're looking for relief from the 1 space per 300 square foot parking stand.
Okay. When I look at this variance, it says, and I could have this wrong, it says for research and development facilities, right? It's 1 space per 1,000, right?
I don't know what you're referring to.
I just want to see the clarity on what's in the ordinance.
Well, my reading of the ordinance is that the use here, research and development, is 1 space per 300 square feet. That's the requirement. I don't know what you're reading.
All right. I mean, that is the ordinance, okay? I mean, I don't know how we.
I think what you should do is, if you're looking at something and you have something, you should show him what you're looking at, and then he will just tell you whether he's looking at the same thing.
No, I can see. Do you see the one with this? Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for this witness from the public? Seeing none. Mr. Coakley?
So, we have one more witness call regarding the other aspect of this overall case. I don't know whether you want to do that tonight.
We cannot do that tonight.
Okay. Do you have a date in mind?
October 28th.
October 28th and October 29th. Or both days,
I heard a rumor about October 15th.
Unfortunately, October 15th, we have an issue of membership. And I don't even know about the 29th. Well, the 28th is the normal, regular planning board meeting. 29th happens to be the 5th Tuesday of the month, and we don't have a scheduled meeting.
We'll be available whenever the board is available.
I'm comfortable with the 28th and being prepared for the 29th as well. And I'm saying that we, board members, I'm comfortable holding the 29th in reserve on my schedule.
28th and 29th?
We'll be here.
Okay,
So that this application will be carried without additional notices to October 28th at 7 p.m. It sounds like it will also be on to October 29th. I think the may carry that against to that date.
I'm sorry?
We waive time periods to that date.
Thank you.
Meeting's open to the public at this time to address any comments that are not listed on the agenda. You may do so at this time. Please note that in accordance with the municipal land use law and case law, any questions or comments about any application must be made in the hearing on that specific application. Any comments on that are not listed on the agenda? No? Okay.
Is the retail, hotel, et cetera, available for comment now, or that's on the 28th and 29th?
be one more witness, Mr. Copley, on the 28th, and have our packet. I don't have the information.
No, we're not talking about the current case tonight any further because it's tonight, it's over tonight, it's on October 28th.
And Troutman will be testifying on the 28th as well, correct? Are you going over the Troutman memo?
Sir, yes. Hearing on this case is carried, so 28th.